This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with Vanessa Feltz.
Lovely LBC listener, welcome to the programme. If you've just joined me, the time 2 minutes past 5, the welcome warm and cordial as ever, the conversation raging as the world situation resembles a tinderbox in most terrifying ways. Many people expressing genuine trepidation, and as you know, these B-1 bombers, 4 of them now parked up at Fairford RAF station in Gloucestershire. So we're taking your calls on Donald Trump. He promised to be the president of peace, didn't he? This week, the Prime Minister defended his government's relationship with the United States, addressing MPs in the House of Commons during Prime Minister's questions on Wednesday.
American planes are operating out of British bases. That is the special relationship in action. British jets are shooting down drones and missiles to protect American lives in the Middle East on our joint bases. That is the special relationship in action. Sharing intelligence every day to keep our people safe. That is the special relationship in action. Hanging on to President Trump's latest words is not the special relationship in action.
And the front page of the Times today, surrender warns Trump. Trump said he was not concerned whether a democracy replaced the regime in Iran and was open to another religious leader, saying, I deal with a lot of religious leaders and they are fantastic. He's called for Iran's unconditional surrender and he brushed off warnings about surging energy prices. Last week, this time, I spoke to Simon Marks, LBC's Washington correspondent. And as we were struggling here to make sense of the unfolding situation, I'm going to paraphrase what he said. He's listening to me now. I can see his face. He's probably going to say it didn't say it quite like that. But effectively, Simon Marks said at this time last week on this show that there was a possibility that the entire conflict was inspired by President Trump's desire to deflect and divert attention from his lack of popularity and falling popularity in the United States and the gruesome potential revelations in the Epstein files. Simon Marks is there in Washington for us this afternoon. Simon, you've watched this week's, I don't know what to call it, conflagrations unfurl as the world, more and more of the world appears to be engulfed in this. Do you still adhere to your original belief that this might all be a diversionary tactic?
Oh, absolutely, Vanessa. I think we said at the time that it was also a distraction that Donald Trump was looking for because he'd just been on the receiving end of that Supreme Court verdict incinerating his tariffs. He'd been forced into the partial U-turn that he's now engaged in on the streets of Minneapolis in terms of pulling his federal agents out of the city, some of them where they'd been brutally going about the business of rounding people up for mass deportations and, of course, had killed 2 American citizens back in January. But, this week, even while this military conflict has been continuing, still without any kind of a plan for how things are going to wrap up, as you and I think, also noted on the programme last Saturday, there are still even more questions besieging the White House this weekend about Donald Trump's friendship with Jeffrey Epstein after another document release only yesterday by the Department of Justice. 16 pages of fresh documents shedding a bit more light on allegations that were made by one accuser against the President of the United States. And also there's been more evidence this week that the economy is not going the way in which he wants it to go. Jobs numbers, 92,000 jobs lost last month in America, never mind any jobs being created. And add to that now, Vanessa, the rising price of petrol at pumps all over America as a direct result of Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu's decision to go in against Iran. All of which adds up to a situation that is not going to alleviate the unpopularity of the President of the United States any time soon. And bear in mind, he is the only president in the modern era to launch military action that on the day it was launched was opposed by a majority of Americans. All the polling that's been conducted over the course of the last 10 days shows that 52% at the thin end of the wedge, 63% at the thick end of the wedge say they oppose military action against Iran. They opposed it before it started, and now in the new polling that's been conducted since the death of Iran's supreme leader killed in that first round of bombings by the Israeli and American militaries, since day after day after day of the Trump administration not being able to explain to Americans what the strategy is, those numbers are holding solid. And it is worth noting that past polling on past conflicts shows that over time, American public support for armed intervention overseas only slips. It doesn't grow. So he's already underwater, and he's likely to be more underwater as time goes by.
So, Simon, all of this means that those of us who are sitting around scratching our heads to try and work out the motivation, the causation and the purpose, the end game and all that kind of semi-logical stuff that you want to have straight in your mind when you're trying to formulate some kind of opinion about what's going on, are even more perplexed and befuddled than we were before you started talking, because really what you did there was give a lengthy roster of reasons why it's an absolutely terrible idea for Donald Trump to have done this from his own perspective in terms of his own popularity and all the things he craves the most, haven't you?
Well, it's a terrible idea to have done it without a plan.
Right.
There are lots and lots of Americans out there, and as there are lots and lots of people in the UK, who have no sympathy for the Iranian regime whatsoever, and who don't want to see Iran get nuclear weapons, and don't want to see Iran sponsoring acts of terrorism and engaging as a bully in its own neighbourhood. But to go about it with no ability to explain to the American public what the plan is here, when you are a politician who was elected specifically on a platform of disentangling the United States from so-called forever wars, particularly wars in the Middle East. I mean, he was having difficulty in January explaining to his MAGA and America First supporters what was the America First interest in attacking Venezuela. Now, you could at least argue, if you were in the Trump administration, Venezuela's in Latin America, it's part of the Western Hemisphere, that is our sphere of influence. But on the one hand, you say to Americans, well, Ukraine, it's an ocean away. It doesn't really affect us. I mean, there's nothing that we need to be particularly... This is Europe's problem to solve. And yet, you don't engage in the same approach towards Iran, even when your own Vice President, J.D. Vance, on the campaign trail in 2024, gave interviews specifically saying it would be a terrible idea for the Trump administration to wade in militarily in Iran. That should all be left to America's allies and partners in the region to resolve. So the same logic was being applied to Iran by J.D. Vance that was being applied by Donald Trump to Ukraine. It's not our fight. Let them sort this all out regionally. Until suddenly Donald Trump decided, and he intimated, said this on Truth Social earlier in the week, that actually there's nothing inherently wrong about a forever war. And if he's now seriously talking, as NBC was reporting last night, about the possibility of even a limited deployment of ground troops in Iran, that's taking the public further on a circus ride for which they just simply haven't been prepared.
OK, all of which leads me to ask, well, why? What? I mean, we know he doesn't seem to have a plan or a strategy, but he must have some kind of idea about why he would do something that wouldn't immediately cover him in glory, that he'd have great trouble justifying and explaining, that he was particularly and singularly elected not to do. So then why? What's going on?
Well, it is sometimes difficult to contemplate some of this, but since former Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene has put this into the public domain, I think it is important to note that, and was a core member of Donald Trump's MAGA movement, and in fact now projects herself as the authentic leader of MAGA after having broken with Donald Trump. I mean, she raised this week the question of whether the president's mental state and his sanity is truly okay. I mean, she did say she wanted to know what on earth was going on. She thought that he'd gone insane.
Wow.
So, I mean, does this mean those questions and that's Marjorie Taylor Greene raising that question.
But does that mean that you have had cause to ponder that possibility yourself? That sometimes when you're reporting on this, you think, hang on, wait a minute, I cannot find any core of reason or logic here. I can't find any core even of self-interest or narcissism. I can't find any kind of conspiracy theory that adds up here. So the only thing I can think of is that this person has some kind of terrible mental health issue. This person is actually psychotic. Are you seriously thinking that?
No, I would not go that far. I'm just making the point that she did. Yeah. And I think it's important that someone here publicly has raised that. I mean, I think there are a whole variety of different reasons coming together that resulted in him making this decision, including the fact that he's engaged in military action, as you were saying in the introduction, you know, multiple times over the last year, way more than anybody imagined, and he appears to have quite got the taste for it. But I also think that in an environment in which everything that happens in the United States this year is all about the midterm elections, even when it looks like it isn't really about the midterm elections. This notion that you are once again creating this kind of sense of emergency here, a war, threats, as we know, from Minneapolis to invoke the Insurrection Act, to put armed forces on the streets of American cities. This is a man who, a couple of weeks ago, was being urged by some supporters to embrace a plan that would see him later in the year claim that China was engaged in election interference in the United States, and therefore there were huge threats to the sanctity of America's electoral system, and he must therefore sign an executive order requiring voter ID at the polls in November, which would again upend the way in which elections operate in states all over the country and raise fresh questions in the public's mind about the integrity of the poll. I mean, I think all of this is tied to a desire to try and turn his popularity around in time for the midterms, but also open to the notion that there's lots of jiggery-pokery that might be needed between now and November to make sure that Republicans, whatever happens, do not lose control of the Senate and the House of Representatives. And there's an element of this that plays into that whole notion that you've got to keep the country on edge, on the edge of an emergency precipice that you might at some point need to use in order to delay, to reject the outcome of the midterm elections, whatever it happens to be, if and when Republicans lose.
And just to ask you about the way in which the United Kingdom is coming over or being portrayed or being regarded in America at the moment, because, you know, the papers are, well, at least some of the papers are full of criticism of Keir Starmer and the shilly-shallying and the sitting on the fence, and some people say it's judicious caution. You know, we were talking about it on the programme. But are Americans, did they have a view on whether we should have come to the aid of the party sooner, or whether we've been cowardly not to, or what the hell's going on?
Well, the first point to make is that they're obviously not keeping an eye as closely as we are on the bilateral relationship, although it has been very widely reported here that Donald Trump flayed not only Sir Keir Starmer this week, but also the Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez. And in fact, Prime Minister Sanchez got it worse than Keir Starmer did. But the state of the relationship, I think, is evident. I mean, when the Prime Minister said this week that you could see the special relationship in action in terms of the things that the United Kingdom and the United States were doing together with regard to this conflict, well, Donald Trump's answer to that came last night in Florida. The opening of Mar-a-Lago's doors to Nigel Farage, the invitation to the Reform UK leader. absolutely seen by key figures within the Trump administration as Donald Trump's Prime Minister in waiting in the UK. Nigel Farage there ostensibly to tell the American president that he was absolutely right. The Chagos deal is the worst deal in history and must be opposed. The idea that that was happening last night, and as far as we know, 6 days after the last telephone conversation between Sir Keir Starmer and Donald Trump, I think tells you everything that you need to know about the nature of the bilateral relationship currently, the nature of the personal relationship between those two men, and the difficulty that any successive Prime Minister is going to have believing any successive American president who comes to power and uses that phrase that Joe Biden used when he took over, America is back. That moment might be coming, and every European leader will have to decide whether to believe it if it's articulated again or not.
Simon Marks, astounding as ever. Thank you very much indeed. Simon Marks, our LBC's Washington correspondent. Did you hear that? So the doors of Mar-a-Lago opened last night to Nigel Farage, who had flown to the United States to Florida to tell President Trump that he felt that Starmer's Chagos deal was absolute pants.